Hello everyone, today we talk about 12th century knightly panoply and more specifically of the historiographical, say, misconceptions in a sense regarding the cause-effect connection regarding the same, so the evolution of arms and armor from, say, throughout all the High Middle Ages, even beyond, right? But focusing, using as a focus point the 12th century specifically. And I do this not because we're going to say anything particularly, revolutionary or whatever, which I don't believe in revolutionary things really exist, but rather, say, addressing the historiographical rhetoric and dialectic regarding these topics, and say, how do historians explain certain arms and armor changes in the broader military and even wider context, right? And don't believe these things are so easy, because there's not really a book that tells you, or a video for that matter, as also the ones I can make, what is the broader picture of the world? That is to say, why we think certain things change in a direction rather than another. And the reason being that scholars became ever more specialistic, and so they often don't even venture in broadly comparative dimensions, let's say. And so what it gets down to is maybe some summaries at the beginning of books or articles, other works that deal with these topics, and say, more or less we know that at a certain point during the Middle Ages, arms and armor evolved towards a certain direction for maybe this and that reason, right? And they throw it there, just like a couple of lines, and then they just go on, and they leave you sometimes with certain actually gross, unrefined misconceptions regarding well, not just military technology, but broadly speaking, the broader world, the communities at the time really worked like. And these are not extremely serious mistakes, right? But they are let's say in a continuistic sense, meaning, of course, the reasons they provide with are generally speaking at least pertinent to the topic, but they don't try to dimension it correctly. The problem here is methodological, rather. How do you habituate indirectly, even with this side information that should serve to introduce, to set the grounds eventually for further explanation, kind of prepare the average reader to think, right? And so sometimes, if you don't have much of a historiographical background, or even necessary historical background about the subject matter, you may acquire these distortions by saying, oh, look, I found it in this book, and this guy seems, reliable and competent and an expert. And so if I copy this way of speaking and I quote this page where that thing is written, I must be right in every debate, in every analysis, etc. And say, from a more advanced perspective, this most instead looks like a gratuitous, again, overlook of the broader methodological problem, say, the connections that stand at the root of that, again, the cause-effect ones, because history is basic, like cognitively, scientifically, we're morally, we reason in that fashion. So if we start from the presumption that just writing a lot means to say sensible things, even when these things are all quoted and whatever, well, we habituate people to reason just in substantial terms and not in formal terms, and which means that you just lose the logical connection capacity in favor of just saying something, right? And surprise, surprise, this is exactly what we're witnessing in our age, that is not just modernistic and secularistic, but it's a very advanced stage of the same, and where basically all people are, can write, can express thoughts, etc., and fundamentally there's no mean, or there's not been so far, to discipline them for the broader collective benefit. Again, in scientific publications, we use a specific method, also of peer reviewing and all these things, which, generally speaking, is the best that you can have at a scientific level in the world. There is no other authority, there is no other procedure that fundamentally provides you with the greater competence. The problem is that you realize, of course, also those that should be a bit more advanced sometimes in thinking, indulge too much towards these attitudes, right? And everybody knows that, because, say, you can never make a trial to the intentions of an author that is just generally talking about something, right? And say, oh, look, in that, it's like, even banally, YouTube videos like mine, right? I, of course, don't express myself here in the same way I do in an article. I mean, that I have to publish. I mean, this is kind of obvious, right? And sometimes people tell me, I'm writing an article and say, okay, how long is that? How much does it take? Well, it's kind of like a 30-page article. It takes me 4 months to be written. It says 4 months from an article. And then you realize that they don't get it, right? That they skip entirely the concept of what of the work that is required in a qualitative sense to write and how to write, again, because they have not been there, right? But, and say, among historians, rarely you find skirmishes based on those premises. And frankly, I think that one of the new frontiers of historiography is exactly this one. At least there are some specific in fact, branches, mostly of philosophy of history, and in many ways they're very debatable, because rather than fixing things, they're rolling backwards. They're saying there is no general category, right? They take it's moral relativism, you understand? So it's complete opposite direction towards which you should go. It is saying, since, I don't know, maybe there's a single work of a famous author in the past, a classical work, saying, this Lucretius de Rerum Natura, what is that? Is that the divine narrative? Is a say an epic narrative? Is it a naturalistic narrative? Is it natural science work, or is it and so rather than saying, okay, let's try to find out what this was conceived like, it says, no, look, every different author says it's a different thing, and so we have to rethink category thinking. Yes, but how? And mostly of the general conclusions is that there shouldn't be any category thinking, which is not surprisingly what is happening just with gender theory and essentially the unhinging of science from, say, of reality from science, or better, people's minds, that cannot understand reality nor science because they're the same thing. And I will not digress too much on this, but let's say, just consider what it means. That rather than, say, we all have standards, we all have approximations that we use, conventional means. What I'm just saying is that that is up to everyone, yes, but the average quality of these approximations is collapsing, while in the past it was normal kind of to use them and to make a strong point for them in the same works. And this is hardly done anymore instead. And nobody really, again, we're too lazy and too unpressured to say, look, you're a professor, you shouldn't write certain things in work because it can be misleading. But we'll partly see what I'm talking about, right? So, first of all, what I'm saying today is not referred to any specific work, but to certain different ones of ways of thinking and phraseologies that are used to describe the evolution of high medieval panoply, knightly panoply especially. Talking about knights, talking about cavalry, also infantry, of course, but we'll see in which terms. So, first of all, I think it's important to start from the concept that panoply evolves. Say, some people say it's wrong even to use the term evolving, because it's not that there is like a theological necessity of a panoply of civilization going in a certain direction rather than another. There may be an improvement, but things like how we fight and what kind of arms and armor we employ in the process is somewhat contingential to very different situations. So there is not an evolution because there is not a linear prepared path, right? We cannot even just foresee at large how war would look like, even in a relatively short term, historically, and therefore it's not much of a, it's not useful even here to condition a fresh mind, let's say, to just about these topics into thinking that there is being that kind of development. Even when you look at knightly equipment and you realize that this did apparently evolve in the sense that it became ever more qualitative and expansive as we will see. This is again the fruit of a contingence, and the most important thing to bear in mind is again the tactical context, as much as, of course, the strategical one, but the political and the social one. So there are lots of different things at once, and very often you find no one that normally is interested in each one of them, or even clearly kind of outlining them in this analysis, because again, these are sidebar evaluations that do not require even a specific historiography, like especially in this topic, or about this topics, like like if you were to write an article, it's etiquette to let's say to refer to quote like from some work, say, for a very basic introduction to the evolution of, or the hemming, let's say, weighing of knightly panoply, look at this and that, right? There's just a bunch maybe of this case of poorly written studies, but still, they're okay because more or less they're a point of reference. There are references to other studies and other sources, so you put yourself safely like that. This happens. This thing of not quoting also happens more often in books than in articles, because articles are very much more to the point, in a sense, and conceived as such, whereas books can also talk very often about the same things. When you write hundreds of pages, sometimes it happens to repeat yourself and to, let's say, give for granted certain things, like everybody knows, that 13th century armor became heavier, and also the one of late. So do you need to quote anyone, right? You will be taken on parole, but let's say it's still you could, because you don't often have a need to quantify that further, but let's say you may still were to express that cause consequence link, called to provide for an actual explanation. Now, a more precise one. So as we know, and I will probably make a video on this in the future, training and equipping a knight cost a lot, right? Because training doesn't even, again, we've often thought that presented with this problem just to be a merely material one, right? How much does an armor cost, or how much does, and very often not considering, for example, how much a horse costs on the long run, right? Everybody tells you, oh, look, this, maybe they even give you the price of a horse, but they don't tell you how much this horse consumes in the first place, which is by far the overwhelming majority of what that horse is going to cost you ever. So what's even the point, right, considering this cost, if you have to, this just the purchase cost, if you are looking at a political social situation. Same goes for the knight, of course, for the same maintenance of the panoply. But there is way more beyond this. There is, for example, and in fact, an entire community, an entire world that produces the knight as the pinnacle, fundamentally, of medieval civilization. And I don't know, if you don't have a functional clergy that is also has a cost for essentially being maintained as an educated class, etc., to indoctrinate the knights, etc., you cannot have a crusader, right? You must really consider how to form the moral forces that are at the base of war, right? And so these are enormous costs that go far beyond anything that even a warhorse or an armor really cost per se, right? They cost really a lot, right? Having just a war horse was the equivalent of price of having a Ferrari today, right? We're talking mostly about that. So that's just the people who could afford to have that. And they were not just, yes, they were a narrow elite, there is no doubt, but consider that they were still, the real elite, the real establishment, a consistent one that had thus the power also to control the rest of the community and to guide it in politics and in war, and thus enjoying also the support of the broader system from a moral point of view. And especially in the 12th century, this was very evident by a certain degree, because the 12th century is a moment of great development that in fact affects the same, for example, gestation of chivalry as an ideological concept, but also this tumultuous growth is exemplified, in fact, in that also as the establishment of chivalry as a regulation for in fact, a narrower establishment, so less leaders, but more quality ones. And this is also what the lock of knighthood really looks like, because before, say, knighthood was always, it's something that evolved conceptually over time. Knighthood existed ever since the dawn of cavalry warfare, right? A millennia before Christ. So what we're looking at in a broader sense is it even transcends horsemanship in the idea of cavalry, that, as you know, is something that comes about in a tactically relevant sense over chariotry only in the first millennium BC. So, well, those ideas of nobility, of superiority, individual superiority, of purity, etc., were already there, right? What we witnessed in the Middle Ages is something different. It's basically feudalism trying to define at a certain point, after this moment of massive growth, those who could enter the establishment and those who couldn't, and thus there had to be a regulation, had to be a check on the same standards of these people. It's a very complex issue that we will debate intensively at some point, because never really looked too much at it. But that throughout this path, let's say, there had been other stages. For example, the 10th century is the moment of generalized affirmation of the militia as basically this sort of let's say recognized but non formally certified knighthood in a broader sense. Because the concept of knighthood actually entails actually a service, right? Knecht, knight is all about, literally, you are a serf. You are basically the guy in the retinue of the lord, of the senior, right? And that's why this comes about, in a sense, because in the 10th century, because that's the moment where the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, you have lots of smaller powers that are created around this individual seniors that are sometimes, really, they can be just single bands, the masnata commanders, right? So you can be a guy owning a couple of modern Bailey castles, and you have, let's say, 80 mounted fighters, because there's horsemen. There's so many other ways to point that out, like in terms of panoply or particular even social differences from the rest of the people that fundamentally work for you. And so you manage to sort of mob around it. You consolidate your seigneury, and this goes on. So that's the moment where that order is becomes somewhat universal. Until Carolingian times, even though most Romano-Germanic realities had de facto, and especially the ones of the Frankish era, and it had always been a private quasi-feudal system in practice, there was still the idea that still freemen were provided with that standard degree of, in fact, of nobility, because freedom was considered in those terms, but naturally couldn't be preserved in a complex system that required, in fact, a professional elite to rule, to fight, etc. So that same freeman, having passed from a tribal to essentially a more extended to quasi-feudal reality, passing from a semi-nomadic to a fully sanitarized situation, had also just softened up and decided that it was better, after all, to be under that guy rather than, say, claiming some abstract notion of freedom that, in absolute terms doesn't really lead you anywhere, because without cooperation and without delegation of power, you can't really have nothing like a functional state. So you understand how complicated it is to discuss these topics without digressing on issues that are apparently very unrelated, but actually they're the same sap of these ones that we're discussing. There is an issue, in fact, regarding also, like in historiography, regarding what it means really the prevalence of mounted warfare, like the decisiveness, especially of mounted warfare, in a given amount of medieval history. In the West, this could be extended to other areas of the world, but let's say talking about this specifically. Well, the point is that very often it's the same military language to be misunderstood. Like when we define the concept of decisiveness, we can look from one side at the Clausewitzian definition, which is, the last, say, in that case, the decisive battle is fundamentally the last in order of time. That's what really makes things decided, and it's a very refined concept. It looks at the fact that you can't really even properly distinguish 50% plus one factor that is making the thing, right? It's always just a surfacial one, an epiphenomenal one, that we say, okay, well, that thing ended it, but it's about much bigger dimensions. We're playing all the time and keep playing all the time, because war is just a continuation of politics by other means. But tactically wise, when we analyze it, this is in fact an approximation, but it's a correct one to use as well, without generating misconceptions. Say, when we want to define the decisiveness of a single arm, and we're talking about cavalry and infantry, we look essentially at who seizes the victory, right? So in a battle, as von Clausewitz says, is what's the last thing it brings to the rout of the army? Well, if you look at battles that are fought essentially in Western Europe between the second half of the 12th and the beginning of the 14th century, you realize that cavalry was continuously decisive, right? Unless we're talking about clashes that, say, the more you descend into smaller tactical engagements, and as we know, greater odds can be reversed, right? The smaller the battle, and the more you can see things like, say, winning with a numerical inferiority of 1 to 10, right? This does happen, right? When you have to look at bigger battles, you see at extremely bulky, complex systems that are very difficult to manage in the same field, and so this creates a much greater friction within your own forces as well, to be that kind of to having that dramatically, projectional capacities in a sense, even on the field, and doing things that are not really available in the larger engagements. So given that we evaluate by approximation the strategic qualities on the grounds of pitched battles and major engagements, yes, it is fair to say that in this timeline, Western Europe, cavalry was continuously decisive without exceptions. Many historians, however, that for sound reason, need to stress the fact that, which I disagree with thoroughly, is that cavalry had been decisive also in previous times, and some say since essentially early medieval times, or even late antiquity. The concept is important because at a point in Western warfare, what you see is that cavalry does take the lead, right? There is a moment when, indeed, that happens between late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. You can already see it in the Byzantine army itself, by the 6th century, also among the Germanic peoples, etc. You really see that cavalry becomes the dominating arm, however, not the undefeated one, right? And the aforementioned change that had been triggered politically and socially in the tribes that passed to become effectively lordships or kingships is exactly this one, that the freemen that up to that point had been very strong and in arms, and this is the equivalent also in the Roman Empire, where there was a state that still maintained large amount of troops, and it was infantry that really made the thing. By collective standards of training, equipment, etc., infantry had remained the queen of battles, as somebody said, also regarding to late antiquity as a whole, in spite of the rising importance of cavalry, because the cracking signs were already there. So, big moment of crisis, the elite takes over, and so yes, you do have fundamentally the core of, say, I don't know, Frankish armies, Lombard armies, wherever, mostly made up of the Visigoths, just to stick to the west by cavalry, right? The thing starts becoming a bit more debatable on the fringe areas. Already Anglo-Saxon England, that after all is as de facto Romano-Germanic country, as you know, and we discussed this extensively in our videos about Anglo-Saxon warfare, had apparently, this is also historiography normally follows traditionally, the idea that the infantry was the decisive arm, right? This is said, generally speaking, also for the other peoples like the Scandinavians, the Viking era, Central Europe, Slavic Europe. Mostly we see infantry, at least we are, like, especially in the early Middle Ages, narrowly meant up to the 8th, 9th century, we see that infantry was the majority, but it's not entirely clear. We definitely see armies like, I don't know, the ones of Poland that back in the 10th century, 11th century still had 1/3 of their armies mounted. So there were important mounted contingents also in Viking armies, as you know, and so I will not digress on this topic. That, again, I will have to address separately in a dedicated video, because it's very interesting, and it really matters to understand really how those cultures have, in fact, evolved over time, because still it was a broader improvement, at least, so we can use the term evolution without too much semantic rape. But the many historians, as I was saying before, used this, looked at the prevalence of cavalry and said, well, this really means that cavalry was therefore uncontested, uninterruptedly on medieval battlefields from the early Middle Ages continuously to, in fact, the early 14th, right? And after that, especially, there is a boom of infantry, and infantry takes over everything, which is not even true. There is a big divide, in my opinion, instead, between that mid-12th century, which is in many ways also the end of let's say, of some, in fact, kind of widespread knightly, let's say, in fact, the proper spread of knightly warfare. That is to say, in the mid-12th century, as we've seen, there is the lock of knighthood, and so just the most, let's say, the richest and most powerful, and so knights, and so also the heavier ones on the field were knights, recognized as, in this sense, as actually recognized of the what was the cingulum militaris since Roman times. It's that, again, that idea of nobility attached to the freeman and he who bore arms. Hence the term also miles, that is fundamentally the Roman legionary in classical sources, whereas it becomes a synonym of horsemen and of less of knight, actually, because the term remains pretty much universally standard also for the non-knights, say, that were the majority at this point. And there is in here, as we've seen, for example, in the series about the German ministeriales, they were technically knights, but they were also technically serfs. How the terms could be used interchangeably by different sources. So again, we will not digress on that either, but you understand what's the concept behind this. And what you see in parallel with that era, and it may be just, let's say, a natural consequence of the broader system, is that at that point, really, knights are not challenged by infantry much anymore. How do you actually measure the prevalence of cavalry? Well, mostly in that aforementioned term that we were speaking of before, that is to say, knights cavalry is decisive in the first place on the battlefields, because they always, maybe the infantry had fought very hard even against the same cavalry, but at the end of the day, it's only the cavalry intervention that makes the victory, right? But there is another indicator, it's a bit in discussion, the entire system, that is to say, you don't find infantry armies anymore. What does this mean? It means that albeit infantry was always there, and actually during the 12th, the 13th century, even increasing in force, and this is the apex of feudal power and so of cavalry domination tactically on the battlefields. What you realize is that this infantry was never practically meant to go against cavalry alone, right? There are some examples, like here and there, especially in Italy and in Flanders, that are in fact the places where infantry is more developed and more effective. But let's say still there is never, before the early 14th century, any purely infantry victory over cavalry. You have to wait for Courtrai to see that, and also that's something that fundamentally stops by the mid-14th century as well, after an important series that replicated itself in some areas of Europe. We already talked about this. I have plenty of videos on these topics, by the way. I have medieval warfare playlist, but also in the question and answer playlist, I answered certain questions about this. So what you see instead before the mid-12th century is that there still were, within the same Western world dominated by the feudal elite, some, say, just infantry units that were meant to fight against cavalry after all, right? I think about the Swabians at the Battle of Civitate against the Normans. I think about the Anglo-Saxons, after all, at Hastings against the Normans, because the Normans go everywhere in that sense, and they are basically the ones who affirmed that Western Frankish feudal civilizational superiority from, in fact, the Western Frankish kingdom that spreads in the rest of Europe as the military standard, right? And so does France, not just Normandy, of course. I mean, talking about France as well. You do find peoples, like especially in the Celtic fringe, that are so primitive that still fight fundamentally with more essentially infantry armies in a sense. Let's say their cavalry potential has been often misunderstood, but yes, it is kind of evident. Like, we look at Irish or Welsh warfare, you realize that they fought mostly with infantry, also because they fought mostly in some kind of guerrilla fashion, right? The future embodied by the Anglo-Normans in a broader political social dominance brought these peoples in the outskirts, right? The less relevant areas, and so guerrilla is enacted only by those who have lost or that would lose in open field. They don't have any other mean, and fundamentally they are defeated already by that point, because the richest centers are controlled by somebody else that has more powerful forces. But in that sense, this aspect, the northwestern fringe of Europe, cannot be considered as particularly meaningful. The same can be said in the Baltic, for example. In the Baltic, there was also a very primitive area. There were there was a very low social stratification. So, for example, you find actually more infantry there. Even the Teutonic Knights, when they go there, they don't have much else to levy. So it's one of the few instances where you actually find infantry wings, for example, in Western warfare. Not that it was something particularly advanced or anything. It's just that, even the same Teutonic Knights probably would have done, or maybe because we don't know what was the spread of that tactic at large. It's just that it's not documented normally, not even in the core of Western Europe. So wherever, the best documentation could happen, and there is speculation that it's just the feudal sources that want to fundamentally downplay the importance of infantry. But let's say in general, you do not see an exception to this rule, right? You don't. right? You find things like, I don't know, some Flemish infantry that ambushes the local elite, but still in kind of some even half fortified situations. You find some Italian infantry that even detaches itself and operates autonomously from cavalry, but that never wins autonomously against cavalry. And it suggests there even some capacity to meet with cavalry without even waiting for their own cavalry to arrive. But let's say it's never that decisive step to say, okay, you have like a real infantry victory there. At Hastings, you don't just have just to make an example of what we're referring to before, you don't just have like an accidental situation, like it could be, I don't know, the Battle of Legnano, where the Lombard cavalry was defeated by Imperial one, and so the Lombard infantry just resisted to the death around the Carroccio before cavalry reinforcement arrived and broke the Imperial army and won. There you have an Anglo-Saxon army that is fundamentally entirely composed of infantry. At least there was cavalry, but it was probably, as we know, less relevant than well, certainly less relevant than in Norman warfare, but let's say still there's a debate which extent. So you don't find like two systems that were at least designed each their own way. Like in Western warfare, you have just like a major homogeneity, right? When you look at England, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, and the outskirts of this where also this broader Frankish civilization expands, you have just the same way of war. You have the same equipment, you have the same tactics, you have the same standards. You can have this kind of regional variations, stronger, weaker infantry, etc. But the core, this heavy infantry, that heavy cavalry that fundamentally is always decisive between the second half of the 12th century to the early 14th, is always there, right? Without exceptions. Before, this is not true. Like even, for example, in early 12th century Germany, that was an area still largely covered in forests and swamps, etc. Very often, because was the infantry after all, right? We know better because sometimes the infantry were the same dismounted knights, right? So there were certain instances in this broader frontier area of the West where you have the same knights that preferred to become infantry. Also because cavalry cannot defend by definition. You have to dismount it, and so it becomes infantry in order to be able to defend. And so in those instances, you cannot say, well, yes, okay, they are infantry, but they're still knights, because aside from the fact that there is other infantry with them, but cavalry and infantry in military arms are not defined by who these people are socially, but what they tactically do, right? So in that case, Germany is a pretty good example, because it was yet to be, say, fully feudalized, and you still find these differences in fact around, like just like the Swabian apparently double-handed swordsmen that fight next to the Paval and Longobards cavalry at Civitate against the Normans, right, that resist also brutally. There are some but are defeated in the end. So there are many interesting survivals of infantry capacity. We have seen it even in Britain. Britain is also a bit of a frontier area, not just in the Celtic War. There is also Norse influence. There's also, like, the north of England is, we've seen it in the recent videos about high medieval English and Welsh warfare. We've seen how there is evidence of some kind of hybrid area with the north, the Scandinavian world, less stratified realities, right? So that's why the Scots, for example, have a lot of infantry, right? Because they don't have enough surplus to have a particularly numerous and equally, and qualitatively equipped cavalry compared to the English, right? And that's why, incidentally, they also are some of the protagonists of the early 14th century infantry victories, right? And Scotland had a very few to do with, say, political, socially with Flanders, right, where you have very rich bourgeois there. So you see that even any kind of economistic socialistic explanation regarding, oh, okay, they're similar after all. No, they're not similar at all. Between the Frisian, even geographically, like between Frisia and the rich Flemish cities of Ghent, of Brugge, etc., they're respectively one of the most underdeveloped and one of the most developed areas in Europe, right? So they have literally nothing to do with each other. And many people that you hear around are very insensitive to the proper level of refinement about this tactical analysis. I've heard, I will not make names, but there are prominent YouTubers that, again, it's always about HEMA and arms and armor testing and reenact. It's never about some kind of hardcore military historian that says that, I don't know, the English fought on foot in the 14th century because allegedly this thing would have remained since Anglo-Saxon time. No, right? England, since after the Norman conquest, was a feudal country that had still infantry contingents like any other country in Europe, but was hardcore feudal, and cavalry was by far the most decisive arm, right? What happens in the early 14th century, also in England, derives from a completely different reason. It has nothing to do with some kind of traditional way of wording, but there are, and this, okay, I will not add, any detail on who said this, but because otherwise you wouldn't understand. But let's say these are people who should understand warfare very much in depth, and these are just, it's just wishful thinking at best. And it's like we know these things too. Like anyone who has been acquainted with the sources, with the studies, is aware of the fact that dimensionally there is no room for that kind of interpretation, right? And it's just an abstraction, a speculation, a guess at best. And so always consider in perspective the broader settlements of a broader civilization, hardly just once. Say the specificities of different countries are very important, of course, as we've just seen, but it's always crucial to read them in the broader picture, because if you don't have the broader picture, you cannot give a measure to them. That's what I always say. If you think that you can go out there in the world pretending to know that you just studying the history of your own country has a relevance in your existence, just know that that actually means that not just you don't know anything about the rest, but that by definition you cannot know, and you do not know anything about your own country yourself. And most people actually believe they do. And this is horrifying. It's one of the most, outrageous forms of mental deficiency you can find in an adult, a supposedly adult being. However, going back to the equipping and cost, of course, you can see how the prevalence of cavalry really occurred, right? It's obvious that here you have a feudal elite that becomes ever more powerful. You see an improvement in the equipment that mostly derives from that, because at the end of the day, again, there is no such thing like a doctrine that is not influenced by the political social background. Right, it's not that 12th century panoply was designed, let's say, on a broader abstract concept of what happened on the battlefield, without considering how much, say, the same elite or whoever could bring on the same field in terms of actual wealth, and considering that these are, very kind of poor societies in general compared to our own. So they start having only by the 12th century a considerable amount of surplus that is still, however, pretty miserable in perspective, and that is invested, of course, in warfare as well, for starting to see a minimal difference from before. I mean, between a 12th century knight and say an 8th century one, there aren't major essential differences, right? The world had remained pretty much similar. What starts happening, however, is we have seen it very often with feudal monarchies, the expansion of cities, and more, is the structuring, the strengthening of a hierarchical system, where everybody also kind of participates, because the system is growing dramatically. And when you see this, you cannot avoid to see the same infantry development as well. right? So there is there yet another important concept, that is to say that the 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 victory of cavalry was more was impacting, right? Also deeply at a moral level, right? The whoever was not part of the establishment was a lesser person, and when you are a lesser person, you are essentially deprived of even the hope, let's say, that something can change, right? This is or that you're capable of changing. There is a huge debate in the philosophy of history regarding that, because many people say, well, there is kind of right and left idea of the thing. The right one says, well, everybody understood the order of things at the time, the hierarchy, and so they just followed. The left thing is saying, no, that they this were oppressed people, but they were not strong enough to emancipate themselves, and so they just accepted. They're always hoping to revolt. Well, it was actually both things at the same time, and therefore, that when I say that modernism and secularism has split the view, as if there were just two different sides of the real, let's say, of the real aisle. Let's say, well, you cannot understand. You stop effectively understanding history. The point, though, is that the moral superiority of the elite was decisive on the battlefields, and there was a big deal also of spiriting regarding an infantryman that could pick up arms against a knight, right? The Lombard pikeman who dealt with imperial cavalry was at the acme of its also technical development, or the Flemish infantry armed with the Gavin de Stave, that took out the flower of French cavalry, was the strongest cavalry in the world. Well, the sources do say they were frenzied by that. They were exalted. They were fanatical about it, because nobody had ever achieved that before. And this kind of prodromes, also in the 13th century, especially by the Italians and the Flemish, had really showed the others around, look that this thing can be done, right? That there is room for another view. Of course, as you know, this was triggered, like the early 14th century victories of the communes and of the rustics, if we can say, were impacting in a sense, albeit by the 14th century, the peasantry altogether, or at least the commoners, were brought down again, and that was also an inappealable defeat, right, of those classes. There is no doubt, right? The Jacquerie brought down brutally the French peasant revolts. The revolutions of the proletariat in the Italian and in the Flemish textile industries in the cities was also equally brought down violently, because they didn't have objectively the cultural tools to make a change, to make a difference. I mean, they were actually the heart of the productive system, but they were too disconnected, too ignorant, and also too avid and too corruptible and too brutal and too stupid, as most the fourth estaters are, to actually achieve anything. And this is a bit the entire history of mankind. There is never, like, fourth estaters can make revolutions, but they will always end repressed and exploited worse than they were before, because at the end of the day, they deserve that. I mean, that's the point. And that's why, largely at best, it's better when the hierarchy manages to maintain a balance between these two pushes, right? And consider that the feudal elite was one of the most viciously violent and exclusively killing trained, in fact, rule that you could even imagine. Again, literally, these people believed that they were a superior genetic race that were ruling on half animals, and that's and knighthood was there to prove that, to prove the fact that God had rewarded them with this enormous power, that objectively were also invested in proving themselves, so much that, in fact, the defeats of cavalry in the early 14th century have been criticized mostly from a moral point of view. These were elites that had won and that had softened up, and so they had lost part of what it was considered that ancestral kind of sacred nature of chivalry that had created so many problems also with the papacy, investiture struggle, etc., over whom was like to gain that that power with or without mediation with God. So we're talking about central problems that likely you have never been told, nor at school nor at university, that instead were basically the only thing these people had in mind all the time, from birth to death, and that would be very much better reintroduced in historiography, that instead has a disgustingly materialistic and deterministic bias in the wake of socioeconomic exclusive focus by the kind of Marxist influenced historiography, and that instead were quite clear, even just who studied history up to 80 years ago. Also extremistic excesses aside from the other side as well. That was also a product of that collectivism and statalism wasn't really, the harshness of the traditional faith at all, because the world was already corrupted irreparably at the time. Now, so I don't remember which point I was making exactly. Yes, that in the 12th and 13th century, in fact, you find, again, the apex of cavalry, which is a relative one, right? Also, yes, it's a relative one because cavalry also increased in shock power in late medieval times, but it wasn't as relatively strong on the battlefield as it was before. Always consider this aspect, and that's where also the panoply cost is quite indicative. I mean, a full plate armor of 15th century knight was definitely something much more but costly and impacting on the battlefield and its mounts and the horse armor, etc., than what existed in the Levant, of course. But also costed so much for, of course, the Levant also not needing that in that proportion. In any case, what I'm saying here is that infantry was rising during the same time in which cavalry prevailed. In other words, we can say, given that infantry had challenged cavalry up to a very few time before, that, again, infantry too had been continuously rising. There had never been a moment in which infantry had been brought under in an absolute sense, right? It had been brought under in a relative sense. And that's also, and I made a video about this recently, the reason why there is another myth that historiography will repeat to you, because also it's kind of classistically influenced by Marx, and says that, say, the average French knight was just an imbecile who thought that was just undefeatable, and therefore would charge without any tactical consideration against whatever formation, and even repeating to do so after reiterated defeats. Well, we have discussed massively this topic, and it is fair to say not just that it is a complete delusion, just by knowing how operationally certain decisions were carried out, and also tactically, by the way, but for the simple fact that all the historical evidence that we can gather points at the permanent awareness throughout all military history of by the side of cavalry, of the infantry potential. And you know what? Why? Because infantry had always been led by cavalry, the same men, the same knights that even led infantry to victory against other cavalry, like the Flemish army at Courtrai. You think that the leaders were burghers? They were the counts of Flanders. They were the Dampierre. Were one of the most hardcore feudal lineages that fought exclusively as knights wherever they fought in France, in Italy, and so on. And that when they are in Flanders, they have those men, and so they have to fight with what they have. And they provide with their military expertise to win a battle against French cavalry. So, of course, infantry was, first of all, very strictly integrated in a combined armed system with cavalry throughout all warfare, right? Before we made the example of, say, the Italian communes having the people, the so-called popolo, that was properly the social or political social organization opposed to the milites, say, sometimes uninjuring themselves even from the milites, but that's because they were objectively very punching as an infantry force themselves, but otherwise, again, they always cooperated, and we have just a couple of evidence of that at Carcano and Fossalta, right? But those are the actual only examples, because again, the Flemish ones are a bit more entrenched into more particular, narrower fields, let's say, of battle, and then the Italian ones, and by scale they're just smaller. But that's the exception that confirms the rule, and still it doesn't even go against it. In any case, the heavy horsemen, if you don't want to say knight, of the Carolingian age had as offensive weapons spear and sword, right? However, and this is also overlooked, he often used the bow too. And the bow, as you know, would later be ideally banished from the knightly panoply, even for hunting. Like the knight killed with a falcon or chased the deer, bear, and wild boar with a pike or stock, disdaining throwing weapons as disloyal. This is at least the version that you're told. Say, the Vatican banished the crossbow. Not really. What the problem was at the point is that, of course, papal armies made plenty of use of crossbows, and any other army, any crusading army, everywhere, right? This was not stopped. There was no bias against it. The problem there, and if you don't read the context there politically, is that we're talking about an age of major heretical uprising, right? And most of these people were commoners who used anti-cavalry weapon. And so if the crossbow was used by communities that were co-opted by the knightly elite, as was mostly obviously done, and so they fought alongside it, why would you care about what weapon you would use, right? There were, at the end of the day, bigger problems, because you had two Christian feudal elites fighting against each other, and the papacy, in fact, there intervened not on the base of which weapons were used, but, finding a solution between the polities. For those also who think, that the terrible popes during medieval times and the Inquisition and Crusades, well, they were actually some of the most advanced. They had some of the most advanced means of, political, juridical, diplomatic dissuasion that were aimed at pacifying Christendom and expanding it beyond its boundaries. And this continued on throughout also the modern age. That's very much overlooked. But again, the myth that the true knight wouldn't use a bow that could still be around as a side weapon by, say, even the fully feudal times, like the late 13th century and beyond, is it was normal, right? Everybody, first of all, knew how to use one, because they mostly hunted, in fact, just with a bow. Yes, this more crude kind of direct involvement in killing the prey, etc., was, let's say, was surpassed by having, as you know, hounds, falcons, etc. But as it had already been the case, just it was the feudal elite that had been somewhat softening up. Or you can't say gentrifying, because in part they gentrified as well. We've seen it even with Louis XI the other day. They literally became to imitate a bit the patrician, mercantile culture of the most florid cities, even marrying to them. So there was this kind of behavior and refinement and civilization and softening again, because the idea was naturally that even though every gentleman was meant, and they would, everywhere in Europe, to be trained, to be in arms, and that's also what tournaments came around as a more regulated form of that, which was definitely very costly and and real in many ways, but it had been ever less lethal over time. You realize that the point is that just it was the lifestyle and the broader culture that had changed over the centuries. You cannot find any kind of regulation towards this allegedly new weapons, which were not new at all. I mean, the crossbow was used even by the Picts in the far north of Europe in the allegedly darkest of ages. these things had always been around. Again, the problem was political in nature. Who did use them and for what, right? If you have a bunch of unruled heretics that want to kill bishops and noblemen, well, that's surely not something you want to see per se, and that tells you also how threatening infantries were by the 12th, 13th century. It was pretty much well known by the same elite. And the future of warfare was for an ever more integrated use of arms with each other. So that's also a myth. There was not the banishing of the crossbow in absolute terms, or nor from, say, the chivalric epos, the few one that we have written also by actual knights describing actual historical events. You realize that all this kind of need for, let's say, depicting warfare from, let's say, in a more gentrified way, well, it was not really there. At least, we can understand that the average knight didn't really give a damn about those standards, because those were for the elite to kind of cooperate among each other, and an ever narrower elite, whereas the average knight was still kind of mostly an impoverished nobleman who searched for his fortune abroad as a mercenary. And whoever fought with them, because kings and other noblemen and true knights fought with them all the time, like, there was no way of saying, like, this is a lesser way of war. I mean, war was war the way it had always been fought, right? So you don't really find even the attempt, if you scratch underneath the surface of this chivalric ideal, for the actual individuals to have any problem. It was not even of using, say, allegedly disloyal means, right? It was not even considered. They didn't care at large, right? I have plenty of examples of that, even concerning flank attacks, ambushes, things like that. They did it, right? It was not perhaps the nicest thing that could be done, especially when it was maybe a king that was doing that, especially when, think about Charles of Anjou at Tagliacozzo, for example. And in there, you have the French historiography hiding that a bit. But, I mean, he beheaded Conrad in Swabia. That was by far one of, even wars on the grounds of, international standards at the time. So, I mean, the world was just going on by its own rules. Chivalry was just an embellishment to be sung in kind of a static sense, but probably nobody at the time saw really chivalry as even a threat or an actual problem for the way war was normally waged, and even by the same authors who sang these things or committed them to be in fact written by someone. So this, I could probably explain it better, but I think you got really what I mean. But back to the Carolingian knight, when you look at the helmet and shield as defense weapons, but above all, the armor, you realize how also gradual the evolution of panoply really was. There was the byrnie, that was a kind of padded jacket of thick fabric or leather reinforced by studs or metal bands, famously enough. People say, well, it's only in the 11th century that this garment was replaced by a more expensive, sophisticated one already in use, especially in the East, like the hauberk. But the hauberk hole also had always been there, right? It was just very expensive, so it was easier, yes, to have something like a partial version of it with these jackets with studded metal plates in it, etc. But we know that this kind of armor had always been around. There had been scale around, there had been even lamellar around, and more. But let's say the hauberk, the coat of mail, had always remained in the West too the most standard actually type of metal armor as a full panoply. So what these historians mostly say when they say look at the byrnie is that about which also we don't have much information, especially from an archaeological point of view, and iconography shows us like a consistently, full panoply availability for the elite and etc. is of course the fact that the heavily armored, in fact, elite was such, also from a numerical point of view, that also in the High Middle Ages, of course, the majority of fighters were not fully armored in metal, like in Hallberg, mostly prevalently in the High Middle Ages, but not only. Don't think that other types of armor were not around. So it's obvious that the alternative to the entire long chainmail, consisting of this dense weave of intertwined rings, the normal alternative wouldn't be a hybrid between metal and organic, right? So if you think about that, the concept very generally is the same one of the later brigandine, and the same one that came back in consideration after plate armor was so, in fact, encumbrant in some at least functions, or at least heavening dramatically cavalry to the point that they needed some other tactical support for, in fact, lighter type of units to be also more specialized and lighter in that sense. While in fact in the with the chainmail, albeit there were different types, what you see is in fact this had remained pretty much standard most of the times up to the 14th century in practice, as which is the moment which in fact the cavalry becomes ever more either heavily specialized or lighter specialized, whereas by the end of the 13th century even squires had fundamentally, because the world had enriched itself, become indistinguishable in equipment from the rest of the knights. So there is all a broad set of consideration. In fact, in the late 13th century you have double-handed swords that reappear. Before I said that there were at the Battle of Civitate the two-handed swords of the Swabians. We think they were actually 1.5-handed swords, but also Wu was there to tell that. The reason why some areas, for example, as we were saying, had, like the same Germany, could have still this this kind of, for example, sword development. It was famous apparently as such. For example, in France they call it the Grand Épée d'Allemagne. Is the fact that you can use a 1.5-hand sword on horseback, but not a two-handed sword. And so since those knights, as we've seen in Central Europe, were more used to dismount, to fight, for many reasons, partial feudalization, also the terrain didn't help more than much to wage full equestrian warfare, let's say, it's possible that those people used such larger weapons, which is a far better explanation of why this was happening in Germany. People say, because Germans were taller. Well, we don't see this in Scandinavia, and Scandinavians were taller than Germans. So it has obviously to do with this other situation, right? It's more concrete, right? You have those double head. You see the famous Danish axe was actually a Frankish weapon, right? So that tells you how it's not really, it's the context in a broader sense. Of course, even anthropometric considerations are practically influent in warfare, and this is also seen by the fact that double-handed swords are spread homogeneously all over Europe since the late 13th century, and they will stay there in the same way. So there's always kind of a more sensible explanation after all, if you again have a comprehensive picture of the world. Otherwise you will just think strangely enough. So light and sturdy, the chainmail throughout the 12th century was coming up to the knees fundamentally. Then it was progressively reduced, was fitted with gloves and a hood and was worn over a long resistant, in fact, cloth shirt. It was accompanied by a conical or truncated cone helmet equipped with a nose piece and a long almond-shaped shield, capable of defending the knight for the entire length of his figure. And regarding the kite-shaped shield or almond-shaped shield, depending what kind of, there was an evolution of this too. You can easily see how this whole thing was connected with equestrian warfare, because it would protect mostly the sides and also the thighs, the legs entirely, sometimes depending on the models. Something that before hadn't been quite needed in the same way. Of course, the more protection you have, the better it is. You couldn't have two shields in combat, because it would have been one very often was doing already encumbrant enough. But of course, if you look at Norman warfare, also the same Anglo-Saxons, you realize it was plenty of these also elongated shapes for infantry as well. Well, first of all, because most of these people were knights, especially in the forward ranks. This is another thing to consider, that the reason why you would also see them represented, depicted, is that you have mostly the elite in the front, right? You must have the toughest guys in the front line of a single line of battle, right? You can have, say, lighter troops in the front, which I hardly can think of a case of unless they are actual light infantry, so they're technically not meant to stand the ground, but just to skirmish. But of course, always the front is made up of the strongest, the ones that lead all the rest of the row, and for which the formation is also created ad hoc, so for which there can't be any front change, switch. This in battle that does not exist, right? The unit has to maneuver to do that, wheeling, if anything, and must have enough space. So what you actually see in battle arrays is that how you're deployed, you're gonna say, right? You find this weird kind of reenactment things today of guys that turn around 90 degrees, 180 degrees, and they think that they still can have a functional fighting formation. I think they should start reading a bit of military history, starting by Xenophon, regarding this kind of internal disposition specifically. But at the point being that as you have essentially the spearhead of high medieval armies constituted by heavy cavalry, and so the heaviest element in absolute terms in the army, because they are the elite, when these guys dismount, of course they're going still to make up the front, right? So it's normal also to find that that kite-shaped shield in the front line, which is also useful because given that ever more projectiles are around, as we will see now, well, still that provides you with a better protection for the legs as well, right? But these guys would also at some point mount on horseback again and fight normally also with the shield, just again one side, which was the most convenient way of using it on horseback. And as you know, there are various gauges, straps, etc., that were conceived properly to maintain the shield in that way, but not all, right? Including straps to maintain the knight hinged to the horse, because literally anchored sometimes, because after some impacts it would be literally catapulted out of the horse otherwise, and we have evidence of that. So there are lots of technicalities regarding this. We're not even entering the details, but now we go a little bit on them. What I was saying is that you see how essentially the circular shield had been pretty much the norm since the migration era, and the reason why the circular shield had prevailed over the let's say a bit the curved one, a bit like the Celto-Italic one, that was pretty much a bit the standard also in Europe, and the Romans had maintained for important times, is that contrarily to what is usually thought, and that's why the late Roman army has mostly instead that kind of flat circular shield instead. The curved one, like the scutum, etc., is in a curved fashion. Scutum is the general terminology, but we're talking mostly about the kind of oval, concave one. That was also similar to the Celtic one. Was designed to an individual type of combat. Roman legionnaires were disciplined but individualistic at the same time, especially in the early Empire, late Republic, and before. They had been very individualistically fighting, right? So the shield, in that sense, was to cover a guy that was not really that thickly packed as one would normally think, right? Thickly packing comes mostly for Roman infantry, starting from the early Empire towards the late. Whereas the circular flat shield is the best, in fact, to provide with a shield wall. So in order to overlap the shield with one another next to you and making the front more compact, and so actually stressing the importance of a greater collective training rather than an individual force. This has happened also because the Roman warrior, also the other ones, also the tribal ones of Central Europe, had become ever more disciplined, right? So actually we tend to mix the chronologies up a little bit here because of standard pack prejudices. The same Roman army had not always been the kind of hyper, at least for those times, standardized and disciplined thing. And especially there is a difference between the collective and individual training. The same goes for the Germanic tribes that, of course, never went just like the Celts, or even when they were actually primitive peoples. They didn't absolutely fight as a rabble. They had always a fine array of a very strong front line, but over time they improved as well. So at the same time, however, it's that the individualism of their own heroic cultures that had diluted. This had occurred in the Italic world, in the Celtic world, in the Germanic world. And so what you see in the Viking era, for example, is something much more beyond any kind of traditional heroic phase. It's something like, again, warlords that have already imposed their power over other free people that are co-opted for war. We've made a video about the Leidhang explaining how that technically happened. And so what you see there in those shield walls, they are nothing tactically, but simply what everybody does when it has shields and wants to maintain a cohesive formation. So it doesn't have any specific punch per se. It's just a defensive thing, right? And people still think that it's somewhat, oh my god, this is a special tactic. If you think that, is because literally you don't have the palest idea of what tactics is, right? Including believing that the pixel out formation or something was something like triangular with a guy at the top. It didn't work like that at all either. But for some reason people have to create myths in their own minds, because otherwise they can't live without superheroes, even though they do not exist. And they don't want to accept what it takes to be a human, and the reason is that they fall dramatically short of the expectations in that sense. So this evolves gradually because the elite, as we've seen, also is increasingly mounted, and of course there is some kind of shield walling, even on horseback. For example, the Ottonian cavalry against the Magyars in the 10th century, the Battle of Blackfeld, etc. Given the Magyars had plenty of arrows and this kind of things, were, as you know, cavalry was also thickly packed, and they kind of bore the shields in a way that would at least protect them. There's also the problem of the horse, because we're not so documented about their armor. Very complicated factors to assess altogether, because we don't have the measures for. In any case, the Miles was also somewhat individualistically minded, and it changes over time. In high medieval times, become ever more collectively trained, and when things get more collectively trained, they basically evolve, but they do differently from infantry. In the case of cavalry, we see this evolves, in a quite evident direction, right? The 13th century is a moment of acceleration, especially of these changes that are fundamentally surpassing this sort of stalemate, almost, that at least a very gradual development of the previous centuries. The chainmail shortens above the knee, a coat of arms of sometimes even precious cloth like silk and more, painted or embroidered, came to cover the entire armor. The helmet assumed a characteristic shape of, say, an inverted bucket, you may call. The critical points of the halberd, where it was most exposed to wear or blows by the enemy, legs, knees, elbows, throat, chest, became covered with pieces of plate-shaped armor, let's say. So, as we know, eventually between the 13th and the 15th centuries, these pieces become more and more numerous, up to the real plate armor, the full plate armor that made the knight similar to a steel automaton, and which, moreover, always served, rather than the battle in the open field, at the tournament or at the parade, right, by the end of the Middle Ages. So at that point, but already by the 13th century, the plate armor made the use of the shield gradually pleonastic, which we mean literally as the shield decreased in size. And this is evident even before that. We have talked a lot about steppes warfare. This is present also in Byzantine warfare, especially during the 10th to 11th century. We see the very heavy cataphracts. The shield is practically useless, right? What's the point of having a shield if not parrying like a single blow, let's say, but if your entire body, including your arm, is all covered by even multiple layers, actually, of armor that weighs, by the way. So you can't even overload a knight in that without significant tactical consequences. This is ultra heavy cavalry that basically is just kept in reserve and intervenes at the end of the battle because it literally barely moves, right? And especially when it's collectively speaking, when you have such heavy units, like the entropy escalates because it takes much more energy just to keep them together, right? So it takes an enormous effort from the men, from the horses, costs more, and some charges were even carried out literally at pace speed. Yes, cavalry sometimes charged at pace because it was so heavy that it would have smashed anything they had in front of them anyway, right? Consider that the average cavalry charge was carried out a canter, which is something between trot and gallop, roughly 40-45 kilometers per hour, not more, because free reins just endangers the broader collective formation, and just the feditore, for example, in Italian warfare, just or other equivalents in the rest of Europe, charge just free reins like hell just to break through. It's this kind of fanatic, suicidal cavalry. The best one, the heaviest one at the same time, which is extraordinary because these men were, again, overly exalted. They were the equivalent of some sort of berserk idea. They were all imbued with this ultra literal obsession with any kind of chivalric epos. They were still the equivalent of those sworn brotherhoods of warriors, and they were just essentially psychopath serial killers in a sense. But they still were functional to that world, right? And they had a tactical effectiveness that, however, fit mostly, in fact, this still relatively individualistic world of the 12th century, which evolves eventually towards the 13th, that is the full surpassing even of seasonalism, of amateurialism. Not that the knights were amateurs, they were true professionals in a sense already, but to say that there requires in the 13th century a much greater collective training and discipline. And so this means it has to be managed by someone who has to command these people, who are not just separated hotheads that quarrel with each other constantly and just think that even kings are just random guys, primi inter pares, right? And so there's a deep change, and that's where the lock of cavalry came with the better definition of dubbing ceremonies and knighthood and chivalric etiquette and so on. and much more, and also this kind of broader military evolution. For example, the buckle, the great helmet, is just a consequence of this aspect, like this the say what was it that really triggered it most of the time? Well, by the 13th century, since cavalry was the decisive arm, it was indeed most likely cavalry warfare, right? The 13th century is also in fact sees the introduction of proper plate armor. I made a video about that, revolving around the statue of Saint Maurice in the Magdeburg Cathedral. That is one of the first examples, and there's a debate regarding a possible Eastern influence, because we see the way this armor was constructed was very reminiscent to the ones used in the steppes. Where in the time of the Mongol invasions, we know also the Poles had some organic version of that survived even up to the 17th, 18th century in local tradition. And so we think that there may have been something connected with missile weapons as well, and more particularly the fact that the Mongols and the steppes peoples were more used to enveloping maneuvers, whereas Western cavalry was mostly frontally designed, right, for engagement. And so this did probably influence the type of armor that was created. But it's obvious that, for example, the great helm and the narrowing of property of the face cover, the eye slits, surprise, surprise, happens where cavalry gets ever more collectively trained, and the thickly packed cavalry formations with couchée lance grip and charging into each other appears at the same time. So it's obvious the narrow eye slits there was because they were just punching with their lances in their faces. So that's the most sensible thing you can do. And what it means before these times, when you don't see such full face cover, is that naturally the type of combat that Amilas normally carried out was much more kind of individualistic, in fact. And it's not that, of course, they couldn't receive a lance blow in the face, and still the nasal and other, there were aventails, there were other forms that were evolving, let's say, to cover better the face, of course. Still, however, shows us that the way these knights were mostly engaged were in a way that probably at that time was a bit more, not chivalric, but let's say more more caring about status perhaps than later. This is the impression I got. I mean, if you're not really, say, that collective packing of knights and the full development of the cavalry charges, we know it, and by Western feudal standards, occurs exactly when there is a lack of chivalry. And so what does this mean? It means that the knights that were the militas that remain out knighthood are basically commanded by the knights, and they're sent against one another with not much consideration about each other anymore, because there is not an elite that they can negotiate on. There is an elite that has taken over, and they just have to obey to, even as they were militas themselves. Instead, by the 10th century, 11th century, you still find this open face helmets and so on, and you realize, in a way, there's not also masks around. These instead exist in the steppe, perhaps also because more arrow fire, but also because the elite was less numerical, but also more elite in equipment, in heavier equipment in a sense, in protection. And so what you realize is probably by the 10th, 11th century, the Milas fought against other militas quite brutally. They chop each other apart, etc. But the broader thing was also kind of a less intense type of warfare, like raiding, pillaging, brigandage in a way, and also much less collective employment of cavalry per se. And so a much more open situation where, for example, running away, even as a lighter type of horseman compared to the one where plate armor comes around, was kind of more important on average. Of course, there was ultra heavy cavalry there too, but it was rarer, right? So the idea is that actually the moment of real equality of nobility in Europe is the 10th, 11th century, and there you maybe find maybe some true sense of let's say not killing each other more than much, but just ransoming and negotiating, because also the situation was much more politically fragmented and unpredictable. So paradoxically, what you see when the chivalric, let's say, ethos comes around, is that this probably, as all laws, fundamentally are telling us that increasingly doesn't work, that there is an intensification of the brutality of warfare, also on a larger scale, and so there's the need to codify it, because otherwise this could have been codified even earlier, in a sense. There was in part that kind of thing in the air still, but it was not so intense and regulated, and maybe exactly escaping the reality of warfare like later on in the 12th century. It was a much more messy time, after all, at least a much riskier one, perhaps on the field than before. But this is a controversial idea as well, because everything was pretty much balanced too. The problem is that, again, we see a more even distribution of the concept of aristocracy. That is not so pinnacled like after the second half of the 12th century. The shield, as we were saying before, by the 13th century reduces itself to just an ensign bearer, right? Also, heraldry starts spreading, starts consolidating, right? Identifying more than it had ever done it, but that had always been existing historically everywhere. It just was less codified as well. It was useful to identify warriors now that the defensive armament covered from head to toe, and this is the point we were making before, that also part of why heraldry was much better defined in the 13th century is that warfare had become much more cruel, so it was more important to distinguish on the battlefield who was that guy, because if it was the real elite, you would have more interest in seizing the guy, but if this distinction had become more important, more necessary now, it's because, again, there was lots of other similar guys that otherwise were expendable, right? And it's the same reason why instead in the 10th, 11th century, heraldry was not so important, because it was more the social difference, being an actual miles that was just defined by the fact that you fought on horseback, that made you valuable, and so didn't render that subtlety more necessary, right? So this is really, really important. It's the same reason why the milites start fighting themselves mostly in tournaments. At a point, the shield becomes even the so-called tournament plague, and there is all a need perceived evidently not to kill, to settle matters in a less bloody way among the true ultra elite, right? Even though the taste for combat, etc., was still there, and tournaments could also bring lesser noblemen to fortune, well, still it was a way of showing, status, right, and power and capacity, also because it costed a lot just to be a knight, especially by the point the tournament becomes standardized. Because otherwise the tournament, as you know, was much more brutal before. There was literally no difference between a tournament and a real battle. They were exactly the same thing. People died, and the local fields were ravaged with actual people inhabiting it. So there was no difference with war at all. So some people say, the fact that the cavalry became ever heavier was not advantageous. Everything you find on battlefields, the way it is doctrinally, is advantageous by a certain standard. There is naturally much about the aesthetic implications that are still, however, connected with the significant technological processes in the field of metallurgy and horse breeding, the knight, we explain it very often, was all one. There was no such thing like, I don't know, our mechanistic, materialistic division between armor, horse, whatever. They considered everything as one. It was the expression of a broader power that was fundamentally the universal one that took the form of that specific knight, right? Because the idea is obviously that we are a fallen kind of a divine race of that eventually took form in the world by diluting morally and physically from perfection. And so we all take form, and this form is supposed to prove our superiority over the others, and this would give us the faculty of ruling over the others. And so these people believed exactly this concept, and so it was so important to impress the enemy. Also from a visual point of view, and this remained, in fact, a thing up to the point which, some say broader tactics started to make a broader difference, right? They are showing off power, but the psychological effect of somebody just presenting himself like a knight is impressive. Only, of course, if they are real knights from the actual Middle Ages. As you know, I don't think that modern reconstructions are particularly respectful towards what really the world in general was at that time. And again, they're mostly materialistically based, in my opinion. Again, in the mind before else. And that's exactly where reconstructions fail, because you cannot reconstruct the mindset of somebody who lead, the motivations of somebody who lead at the time. So even, combat cannot be replicated. It's lunacy, right? It cannot happen. If you don't go there to kill each other in that specific context with specific motivations and beliefs and aptitude and lifetime spent in that context, what's the point even trying to pretend to derive any information to people in the 21st century beating each other dressed up like knights? I mean, seriously. And without, of course, most of the times any adequate background, or at least, in fact, quite misguided one. And again, if you read these same historiographical concepts, you will realize how easy it is also for the scholars to be wrong, right? And there is no other expertise outside of that one in these fields. There is reenactment. It's not an alternative. It's not a better thing. It's not a more valuable no, right? It's just another thing entirely. It's just marginally touching history by scientific standards. And again, this site was impressive. The mass of tempered iron necessary to guarantee the defenses of a single knight became enormous. And equally huge became, despite the skill of the master smiths skilled in forging thin and light, but at the same time resistant plates, the weight that the warrior had to bear. Like the costs of the equipment then went up further. Moreover, it became impossible to engage men so heavy with metal in 2 long war actions, as we've seen. So that's where at the end of the Middle Ages you have a very important tactical specialization with the lance that has essentially revolves around the heavily armored the men-at-arms proper, but then it has lots of other, has the pikeman, has the gunner, it has the archer, it has the field aid, it has the squire, it has a mounted crossbow, and so on, right? So lots of other troops that without which the lance proper, so in origin the actual guide, that does not work, right? It's also important to stress that, of course, knights had hardly ever fought alone. They always had some support, because their equipment was always, in absolute terms, for a human being, an impressive amount of effort to require. addressing the horse problem. I mean, it was necessary to select more and more robust, capable mounts for supporting such massive weights, but this greatly reduced their speed and maneuverability as well, and therefore exposed the riders for a longer time to the enemy offensive. This is a huge problem, right? Again, you want an ever more punching cavalry, you have to reduce maneuverability, right? And consider that in warfare, you cannot do without these the heavier, the lighter elements, as we've seen, but most of the times what is used lays somewhat in the middle, right? Even if at this point the balance is dramatically shifted in favor of cavalry, and so of the elite in the first place, still the average kind of cavalry which you would rely on to do most of the job was there were still knights, or at least milites, but they were on average not the ultra heavy type, right? It was just to be more tactically and doctrinally employed, as this example proves, because the problem of cavalry is, of course, that once it has exhausted the charge, it's in deep trouble, right? If it has not broken the enemy, cavalry cannot defend by definition, and therefore it is overwhelmed. At least knights were able to defend themselves standing from the horse, but in a very precarious situations, the horses could punch, bite, kick, and they actually killed people because they were trained to do so. And other horses, they really aggressed them. But again, there is hardly any more dangerous moment for cavalry than just after having exhausted the charge. And so the idea is that why also cavalry is ever more, like there are these big cavalry disasters at some point towards the late Middle Ages, is exactly the fact that is, in fact, mostly overlooked in the broader picture, that normally, if you break the enemy, okay, you have won. But most of the times it happened really like this, because cavalry remain at large decisive, even throughout the 14th and the 15th century, in spite of the infantry victories. But if it found an enemy that was resisting enough for blocking the heavy cavalry, well, it can be the same enemy cavalry, by the way, who attacks back again, frontally against them. This knights, basically, they're done for. Right, it's better to surrender immediately than even fighting to the death at that point. If there is, of course, an enemy that is going to spare you, and you know that, and that's why also the refeudalization of 14th, 15th century warfare is very important in the broader order of things, but because the meat grinder was in many ways probably the 13th and the 14th century, right? Whilst through gunpowder comes around, and still there is a great care for individual knights, and as we've seen there towards the end of the Middle Ages, and there are, because they are also ever more important individuals, they're in charge of ever more people in general, and that's the reason why gradually these people also, by remaining men at arms for a long time throughout all the modern age, they still are a bit sheltered from, say, they are ever less sent like in the first line, at least on a long-term perspective, right, or on habit, right? A king was needed not to risk too much, like the same Battle of Pavia with Francis I that is captured by the Imperials, where at that point, it was esteemed enormously, but people were not happy of kings already at the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the modern age, that exposed themselves too much, right? For the French, it was just a broader matter of, because they were very much more into chivalry per se in their feudal ethos. They had to prove that in front of a country more than other people. But it was becoming, in fact, because of that French defeat, anachronistic and dangerous. It was a problem for the Saint Charles V because he didn't literally know what to do with a captured king. It was and the king of France, by the way. So it was an enormous problem. he feared he would die in prison. It would have been a terrifying problem, and he almost did, because Francis I got sick, and Charles I was always there, close to act, and there is always a history about those two. Once they even slept together. I mean, not in the bad sense, of course, but just to know that that was still what chivalry was. In a sense, Charles V was also much more kind of romantic individual in that sense than Francis I was much more of a ruthless, modern-aged mindset, let's say. But at the same time, Charles V was much less of a soldier than Francis I. So what I'm saying here is that we shouldn't really, again, focus too much on cavalry per se and say, oh my god, this got so heavy. Look at them on the field, it was even risky. They couldn't even retreat safely. And this aspect is important, of course, because individually we know, think about Marshal Boucicaut that made acrobacies in full plate armor. So of course they could do it. It was extremely exhausting. And yes, there are instances of that, but there is also instances of knights that literally said they were unhorsed and they couldn't get up, right? Because of the weight of the armor. So the weight of the armor, yes, was light enough to make the fighter perform everything he had, but still it was no joke either, right? So, and it required a dramatic level of athleticism, by the way. And that is the measure of the effort that still this man made, which was enormous, really. But the point again is that collectively, cavalry again becomes more difficult to handle. If it was still around, though, which was the case overwhelmingly in the late Middle Ages, you should rationalize that this thing was useful and it was performing a very specific task that is easy to see. Of course, every kind of armor improvement derives from the need of security, fear, if you prefer. And this is wholly normal. In theory, according to universal tradition, the true hero fights just it's like David against Goliath, right? Is just spirited. He doesn't need a great, strong body. Doesn't need, special weapons. He just has to win by his mind, and this is a tradition in every tradition. That's why the barbarian in every tradition is the big, stupid guy. From Roman to Scandinavian mythology, the idea is that the hero is the mind, the one that has wisdom, right, and not the ultra cocky young, let's say bodybuilder. Let's put it in this way. That also has a role. That's a very important one. It's one of the feditori, like for example we were saying before, is the young man that has to prove to be tested. Still, however, is still relatively unreliable. And it is, because the prefrontal cortex doesn't consolidate before 24, 25 years old. And at that point, 25 years old, we're just full maturity. And generally speaking, if you were a man-at-arms, you didn't live very long, tendentially. At least, was probably not one of even the single riskiest or deadliest, positions that you could find at the time. But still, in order to command, you have to be mentally sharp. So, if you look at things in perspective, so in relative terms and not in absolute ones, you can argue that the reason that brought cavalry to become ever heavier were always the same, right? The reason why it became so heavy in the Middle Ages is the same reason why it became heavier, let's say, in the 11th century as opposed to the 8th. Right, it's always the same one. However, there is someone who says, again, that believes this, that in the 12th century, the knight was somewhat invincible, because if not by someone armed like him. As we've seen before, it's important to stress this symmetric issue, that is to say, these knights fought mostly against other knights, right? And that was enough for making most of the other formation break, and the infantry also to abandon the field because they knew that they couldn't be countered. So always bear in mind there were other mounted troops there, lighter cavalry to chase the enemy, the routed enemy. But the role was mostly, again, a knight versus knight thing. And so when we look at 13th, 14th century, we see, you see here, there is armor spreading more. Something must have changed. It was threatening the knight. Really? Because this is really debatable. You see, I don't believe personally, again, that there was much less of a threat that infantry posed in the 13th or 14th century opposed to the 11th, to a knight. I really don't see that. It may be true depending on certain specific areas, but at the same time, we're so poorly documented about the earlier times, tactically wise, that first of all, we truly don't know. And secondly, we do see cavalry being challenged, at least, or even dismounting, as we've seen. Even in Carolingian times, you really have, think about the Battle of Zuntal, you have a certain general understanding that cavalry was aware of the risk posed by infantry. And when people say, well, there was, maybe it's because there was more crossbows coming around, or infantry had more performing, say, anti-cavalry weapons. Infantry too mostly fought against other infantry, could fight also against cavalry, so their weapons were surely designed to cope effectively with, in their case, according to the odds. But the broader point that is often not made is that even if crossbows became more performing, if again there were weapons that were meant to open the armor, still when you look at bows, at other, again, even peasant weapons, even in early medieval times, you had that threat, right? Longbows, for example, were very much used. You find them pretty much everywhere in Western Europe. Even again in these centuries, and even used by knights. And you understand there that they had also anti-armor capability. So why would that become kind of a much more important thing? Well, because the idea is, of course, that cavalry is pressured, say because we are looking at the single knight, right? And when we look at a single knight, we realize that in the forces that the battlefield could produce, with ever larger armies, with greater collective training in arms and combined arms interaction, of course the single knight could find himself, say, under, I don't know, in a situation where tens of thousands of quarrels fell in an hour. And so if we was just maybe at the corner of the cavalry line, where where on the side there was infantry, that there was this kind of crossbow exchange, let's say, maybe he would be more exposed to that risk and would be more likely to get killed, and also by those bolts. And so in general, since you could not really predict where we would be everywhere, and the general threat was present everywhere, and you would think, yes, even in the individual sense still, because weapons were more performing, but as we know also, armor in this sense was designed to cope with it and to essentially eliminate the effect, right? Yes, it was normal for these knights to become heavier, but I mean, the reason why you have an almond-shaped shield that covers up to the leg, and in the 12th century, say, and in the 13th century, you find that plate armor starts spreading among the other places also from the legs. Oh, of course it means that there is some risk posed by infantry, but it's always posed. It's also posed by the almond-shaped shield, and also infantry was not so rich as it would have been after. The same goes for knights. So trying to find a cause effect as if these two arms developed at different rates or in a different context is practically misassessing most of the intertwinement of that process. They were happening all at the same time. You don't have to wait for crossbows to have heavier armor. Because, if you have, let's say, more wealth and you can use it to protect yourself, of course you're using heavier armor even to fight against an equivalent of yours, which is, telling you the truth, as a knight, the most, direct foe that you're going to meet. Together, especially in combat with dramatic punch, right? Remember that a cavalry charge means there are other people that are charging straight at you. You impact people at 90 kilometers per hour, practically, summing the two speeds. So even if infantry had become so terrifying, it hardly was. It was at least half of the problem, if you consider speed, ideally, right? Because they didn't run, or they didn't actually run against cavalry when they were charged. So at best you would charge them at 45 kilometers per hour, which is half the way you would do against a cavalryman. But in general, you see that they are all blended as factors, and you cannot distinguish them. So in other words, no, you don't have plate armor just because there is more crossbows around. At least even if there was an imbalance in that sense, the broader spread of armor in that fashion is eventually connected to a much broader development of the entire community rather than that specific factor that may be just the tip of the iceberg. And it's not even actually expressed by the sources at the time. We just invented it because we had to find a technologistic interpretation of the story. It is true, and again, that the 12th century, the second half of the 20th century, Locke brought to the broader coercion of other knights under the rule of a greater elite that could dispose of them more directly and not as cannon fodder, but still in a more dangerous way than before. And that, again, in this greater compression of the various arms of larger armies, the knight would be more challenged overall, right? But again, don't think that in this sense it's because cavalry is underperforming. On the contrary, cavalry is ever more and better specializing. And even though there is this sinusoidal up and down, apparently, it's not before, in fact, the Renaissance that you actually have the brutal contraction of cavalry that eventually reemerges still by the immediately afterwards, practically, even though gradually, to regain an important role in the 18th century, as you know. So what I mean is that in medieval times there weren't so many, there wouldn't be so greatly punching factors as, in the Renaissance, for having a decline, a much greater distancing of infantry and cavalry force, right? You find it again in the second half of the 12th, in the 13th century, with cavalry really has an upper hand. But still, infantry is pretty close, and it was also before, even more, as we've seen it. So this constant, comparison should actually be understood as the more linear, gradual improvement of a broader civilization, more than a competition between the various arms. So, again, when we look at the honor tributed with the dignity of chivalry as a kind of international one that recognized the knight in the common education and common imaginary nourished by epic poetry and Arthurian novels. In the logic of such an international, the defeated enemy knight would be brother of arms, who had the right to be treated as best as possible according to a rigorous ceremony. Well, even if these ideas are styled out for the first time, clearly, at least, or conventionally, or in a kind of regulated form, in the second half of the 12th century, this doesn't mean at all, first of all, that this thing was really happening. If anything, the contrary. Nor that this applied to all knights. In fact, to all knights, to all milites, right? Because up to that point, that's what, in theory, knighthood was attributed to. That is, everyone. The sacred power, divine power, provided with the Cingulum Militaris was for everyone who bore arms at that kind of higher level. In theory, everyone, right? In theory, everyone who had any form of imperium. So this was, in many ways, like a reaction, a lock, an exquisitely political and social definition of certain boundaries. And the more this thing went on, telling the truth, if you look at it in perspective in the following centuries, and actually the more careless it became towards the milites themselves. This could be seen easily from a strictly political point of view, but it's pretty much well known that there is a crisis of the early concept of knighthood for example, in France or in Germany, towards, say, between the 13th and the 14th century. There's even an hemorrhage of knights from these countries that go fight in other places because they had impoverished, and they start becoming, for example, mercenaries in Italy that relied ever more, in a certain phase in the first half of the 14th century, ever more essentially just on foreign elements. Not because the Italians didn't have knights, but because they preferred to use these that were treated as soldiery. Like, the actual term is stipendiarius at that point, very often, and milites, and miles, at the singular. And they fight, and they're never like, say, okay, of these 1,000, 2,000 milites, we care about the fact that they're knights. They don't give a damn about them. The big knights, the big shots are the local lords, are the local, even the same foreign lords that commanded this other milites. But nobody gives a damn about the milites. These are just troops, right? And nothing else, right? It's that. The thing is that monetized is that kind of modern and secular in nature, right? Nobody cares about the thing anymore. So actually, the affirmation of chivalry kind of already pertains to a phase in which the ancestral concept of knighthood is largely lost. We're still already talking about late medieval times, and this is witnessed, of course, by the aforementioned gentrification process. And so you understand that already by the 12th century, this was actually going on. The 12th century is, in fact, the moment in which economy revives, in which there is much more mercenaries around. And so again, who are the knights the chivalry talks about? Surely not the scum that was hired for nothing just because he was, armed with a knightly panoply and a war horse. That could be literally anyone at some point. There were lots of they're very well documented in France, in Italy. Think about the so-called cavallate. Like, literally, there were some citizens who were owed military service on horseback because they were rich enough. They could simply send somebody else. And who were these somebody else? Were they necessarily other aristocrats? Not really. Right? It could be just desperate people that, however, saw that as an opportunity for social promotion, things of this kind. And after all, as we were saying before, by the end of the 13th century, which was also the beginning of the condotta and other similar company systems, pretty much everywhere in Europe, think about the glebe, think about the indenture, the squires, the idea of the old squire that is just a servant, they're less armed, and doesn't quite exist from a tactical point of view anymore, because cavalry formations are much more like a collective things now. There's not the single horseman, say a single knight, the milas that operates, let's say, a bit more individualistically with the squire that waits for him in the back or shouts him, look back, right or left. Like, that belongs to, in fact, still a 12th, maybe early 13th century reality. Later times, the thing is that the squire had become factually just another soldier, equipped just like another knight, right? And so you realize that even the differences in military professionalism deplete themselves, right? And that, albeit, of course, lots of these people were still noblemen themselves, that concept of nobility was still a lesser one. We have seen it in the video about the French nobility and in the French army organization with the 100 Years' War. We saw that there is this bulk that continues throughout actually the old ancien regime of impoverished noblemen that still, however, choose the job, say the profession of arms. It's a bit like the hidalgos in Spain after their conquisted, just because they don't have much else, and they're the actual ones that as noblemen, doesn't matter how impoverished, are still expected to be more than the others, because they still, yes, they're impoverished, but they have some lands, some castles, some titles, just in the hierarchy at very low, and they're the majority. And so they, given that cavalry again is still largely decisive, they are also the bulk of it on the field, but they're commanded by somebody else in the feudal hierarchy that has become ever more rigidly, structured and subdivided. This aspect, in my opinion, is very, very important, right? So the idea is that, for example, people mix things up. They think that it's the Crusades that teach, say, that destroy chivalry in a sense, because there were different types of strategic or tactical means. Which ones? This is something that I never understood. Like, how do you think the Near Eastern warfare was different from the one in the West? Like, even if Crusaders had to cope with, say, more flexible, more mobile enemies in a sense, still the enemies paid that at the cost of being lighter, and they weren't even that different from each other, telling the truth, especially in the heavy element of the heavy cavalry. In fact, there was a feudal culture also coming from Central Asia through the Seljuks, but the same Muslims in general had, same Arab culture had this, some sort of equivalent of chivalry and knighthood, chivalry especially. So the concept here behind this whole thing is quite misleading, right? When you look at siege techniques, and that of course require also troops that were non-knights, but absolutely the protagonists were still knights. This is yet another mistake. You realize that, these things were already there in Europe, right? The crossbow was already there. The fortifications were there. There is no proof of a cause consequence effect between the Crusades, saying a spread of technology in the West. If anything, it's like the other way around. Technology was already known. The West simply was growing and applying it, and even the translations from Greek and Arab were actually sought by the Westerners that could already translate those languages and were already pioneering the fields of the treaties that we're in fact searching for. And in this sense, they came to do that at a point where they had practically nothing to learn about them, and they just were needing for some theory that could be systematized, in fact, also with a debatable degree of actual positivistic use, and more like some sort of broader intellectual interest. So if you read some historical say average books that we read in the West about medieval warfare, and they're probably the only ones that also the world reads, because there is nothing better out there. The impression sometimes is that historians want to depict you is, again, of this kind of irreversible changes or triggering factors that led to some greater. No, it was mostly a very gradual, almost imperceptible at the time change, even though I must say that yes, arms and armor improvement was considerable for the time being. It was also accelerating, as you know, towards especially the 14th to the 15th century. You have there different generations. You have literally very different types of arms and armor, at least, vary by some kind of secondary aspects. Again, the essence was practically always the same. But in that regard, you have to evaluate the forces that came from within those same communities, not just the fact that you see, oh my god, there is an armor that changes. Yes, but let's consider the fact that we're talking about very complex systems, and that it was obvious for things to change in that way without being there any specific, let's say, factors that you can to extrapolate as to provide with a monofactual explanation through it. Right? Again, the longbow and the crossbow, like, were they, say, in the 13th and the 14th century, or even firearms, right, as they were introduced, kind of more challenging in relative terms for cavalry than in the previous centuries, that this actually triggered the rise of plate armor that before was not needed. I see things differently. I think that these things were developing further because there were more resources in general, and so everything was evolving at the same time. And of course it was a cause-effect consequence in each other, but this was just minority in an intrinsic mechanism of development that would naturally create arms and armor just to cope with each other. And this balance is maintained fundamentally up throughout all the Middle Ages, when firearms really start making a difference. But again, not firearms just because of the technology, but because, again, how many could they be fielded? How standardly trained could the units using them be? That's what makes the difference, not the technology itself. Because otherwise, do you think that in the 13th century, say they didn't have the means to achieve something that maybe even just in the 14th could be achieved? Of course they could, right? The point is how much would cost and how much cost-benefit ratio really was, and that's where it makes you understand how relative actually these threats were to armor. Because again, the main threat of a knight in general was another knight. And no, not even a gunman, right? This is not true. Throughout all the 15th century, gunfire was pretty much less important than most, type of melee kind of blow, right? So, easily, right? And consider that sense armor was developing, and it exists around as long as it would remain effective. So the alleged destruction of the mythical invulnerability of cavalry, frankly, is I think is a modernistic myth that derives from us looking especially at the early 14th century, needing to say, oh, finally there is infantry that for the first time after only 150 years challenges cavalry and is also successful. It is true that since early medieval times you don't find many victories of infantry against cavalry. There are, and aside from that, they are mediated by terrain, by sure there was some other cavalry around. But even if we look at the early 14th century, well, it wouldn't be so strange that the imbalances of such a much bigger system like the 14th century compared, say, to the 10th would produce on a larger scale the defeat of cavalry, even if the best one, like the French one at Courtrai. This concept normally is not really focused on. And in fact, if you read the sources of the time about, for example, Courtrai, you realize that while surprised and they say, "Oh my God, this is a miracle," and nobody says like, "Oh my God, the world has changed because from now on infantry will win." Nobody perceives that. They think that, "Oh my God, this is an anomaly. It's not really normal to have happened." Sometimes some infantry what we consider eventually infantry victories are not really perceived as such even. This happens sometimes, even in environments that are somewhat close and in contact with one another, also because Europe is ever more deeply intertwined. So the impression there is definitely instead that we looked at the bourgeois of Ghent and Brugge at Courtrai as, "Oh my God, infantry equates future, equates democratic people, equates modern armies like the ones that we study today. So wow, yes, it began there. The infantry is rising. At the time, the mythical invulnerability of cavalry has ended." I don't know how to tell you, but in the Middle Ages, that invulnerability of cavalry had never been so prevalent for more than 1.5 centuries, right? There was nothing like, right? There was if there was anything like a mythical invulnerability, this was of the elite rather than of cavalry per se, meaning that a miles was a miles already in the 10th century, and even though at the time, of course, peasants could be quite offensive, etc., still what counted is a miles there, as we've seen, could fight even on foot. So nobody really cared about cavalry or infantry. Of course, cavalry was attached to the broader concept of the equestrian hero, of the Proto-Indo-European steppes, etc. But say historically, in Europe also, the majority of peoples had been sedentary, right? The infantry was decisive in the Celtic world, in the Germanic world, in the Roman world, in the Hellenic world, in the Iberian world. So, and these peoples had still maintained the mythological ethos of cavalry, but because they cared about the elite, they didn't care about much whether they were mounted or dismounted in a given combat that was not mythical. They cared about the fact that there was an aristocracy that ruled the world. So what really was impressive at Courtrai, if anything, was that, more than cavalry or infantry. Also considering that the English armies that defeated the French ones during the 100 Years' War, with their dismounted, with their infantry forces, were royal armies in which the decisive element was made up by the men-at-arms. So hardly anything non-aristocratic in nature. And no, the longbowman individually wasn't perceived as making anything revolutionary. It was just like the average missile trooper that cooperated and combined arms with a man-at-arms. The other countries had crossbowmen, and the alleged superiority of the longbow, even over the crossbow, in a collective sense, has been profitably criticized for the Middle Ages, historiographical, for that, even the heyday of the English tactics, for historiographically. So I think the more you address these topics and the more you realize how much we've been truly not lied to, but somebody decided to think pointing at a way and not considering all the others. And this is kind of what people would say mainstream historiography. I don't believe there is anything mainstream in anything, because I know that reality, again, if you think there is things like mainstream, single thought, or a single propaganda, you don't know the world. You don't know history, as a matter of fact. You don't know that happens all the time. There are tons of different ones all the time, and that there is hardly anyone agreeing with anybody else, and that this is mostly the actual problem. So very far from anyone wanting to impose you a single idea. that's called paranoia, and it's typical of the fourth estaters. It's typical of the little people that don't understand anything and pretend they are special. And that's why those people have drank this stuff. And that's why, because, in the age of mass culture, etc., these kind of ideas appear historiographically, because they appeal to the lesser people. And this is a deep problem in general, especially when the latter think they're entitled to anything without having deserved it, which is called communism, and that, as you know, most also alleged conservatives actually bind to, because they're, after the death of the Ancien regime, what you see there is just a bunch of statalist collectivists, even when they actually complain about the state and taxes, because what that actually means is that they want to be maintained with magical means, without making any effort to make a civilization stand on their feet. And this is incidentally why the moments of prevalence of the people in history compared to their own possibilities were quite short, and they're destined to end again. Primarily exactly because of these people. And after a brutal repression, by the way, and I can say it's a positive thing for it to happen, but let's say if there are not if the process of educating them fails, objectively, that's unavoidable. They call them on themselves. Like, it's not that nobody would like to live in a feudal world, even though we already do, because when it's that clientele's ever stopped, right? The problem being that, successful civilizations are the ones that have a very strong middle class who perfectly knows what to do, and it's not free, that is to say, alienated from the world. Again, that's the fourth estate view of the world that was not known until, the fourth estate became the prevalent, decisive element in communities, right? Already the third estate has an allegiance to the hierarchy, to the power, to God, first of all, and to the king, let's say. The fourth estate is pure madness, and you can easily see it from essentially our constant decline, philosophically, scientifically, morally, from the 19th century onwards, right? The progress is not counted on absolute material gains. It's counted on the quality of thought. That's why universal tradition stressed, of course, that it takes to be intelligent to rule the world, in case you didn't notice, right? But I guess that even reading about 12th century knights can open minds a bit regarding what we're going through in the same way. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.